Hey guys, welcome to Mystifying Miracles. Today I'm going over a story about a couple that begins hearing bumps and noises in the night. And they wonder what it is, how to get rid of it. I'm going to dive into the details of it and what happened, so stay tuned. A woman named Susan Lytek. She had put her faith in Christ and became a follower of Jesus. But get this, she says the moment she did that all hell broke loose. Now stay with me. I'm going to get into her story and the specifics. Susan and her husband, Gary, they started hearing these bumps and noises, especially at night in their home. And at first, they kind of chalked it up to the neighbors just arguing and, both said it was a normal occurrence for their neighbors to fight and bicker. So for a long time, they just said, it's them again. They even blamed it on their cats. They had two. If you're a cat lover, you know how they are. They can run around the house, knock things off the table. So they would even blame it on their two cats at times. And during this period of time, as all this is going on, Susan said there was just something that was dark, like a heavy presence, and she couldn't put her finger on why. Even so, that darkness still felt like it was there. Susan says she rejoiced in her new relationship with Christ. That gave her comfort and that gave her joy. Well, one evening, Gary and Susan were praying together in their bedroom, getting ready before sleep that night. Their two kitties were nestled up at their feet at the end of their bed, and as they're finishing that prayer, they hear a loud crash coming from downstairs. And Susan says she found one of the framed photos in the middle of their living room, just on the ground. She immediately began to cry and shake. She said the fear, it was overwhelming. She also said that where that frame was laying in the middle of their living room, there was no way it could have landed in that position where it was, according to where it had been hanging on the wall. The two go back to bed. Gary is able to fall asleep, but Susan, she's too scared to even do so. So she pulls out her Bible and she reads it all night long. She said she got no sleep till the first morning light, when she was finally able to get some rest. Well, the next night she was working, and she begins relaying all of the things that had been happening in their home to her boss, John. Now, John was actually the one that witnessed to Susan and led her to Christ. So they had become good friends. John tells Susan, sounds like spiritual warfare. And then Susan asks John, well, why me? John then begins to question Susan, and he asks her, hey, maybe in your past, did you ever dabble in the occult? Did you ever have anything to do with ghosts, poltergeist, demonic activity, anything like that? And Susan answered, probably, but that would have been years ago. And she said to John, quote, I gave it all up after I got scared at a cult meeting when I was 16. End quote. So the story didn't go into any specifics about that particular thing, other than to say she got spooked when she was 16, when she went in on a cult meeting. But I guess it scared her enough to kind of brush off everything she had been involved in. For several years back then, Susan did tell John, she was heavy into astrology. Susan told John she used to chart the signs and aspects for people that she wanted to be her friends in her life. And as she started doing that more and more, Susan says she began to feel quite powerful. And it led one thing to another. She began diving into the occult, palm readings, seeing psychics, that sort of thing. And then Susan tells John, quote, I had a spirit guide that showed me futures, end quote. That's when John turned to Susan and he said that would do it. But Susan claimed to have stopped talking to this spirit guide when she gave up the occult, when she got spooked, which was years ago. So she wasn't understanding any of this. Well, the two had to get to work. They worked in this catering business and they had a banquet to serve. So they do that for the next few hours. And as they're finishing up and they're cleaning up everything, it's about 1 to 2 a.m. And John decides to pray for all the workers, including Susan, before they all head home. He also prayed for Susan and her husband Gary that God would give them wisdom to be able to overcome all these attacks that they were having in their home. The next morning, Susan had a class, so she had to sit through several lectures. It was a long day. She does that. Then she goes home. She's tired. And Gary was out playing golf with a buddy. So Susan decides to lay down and just have a little rest. It was about 4 p.m. when Susan snuggled up with one of her cats on the couch. And she was just about to fall asleep when all of a sudden, she starts hearing a noise coming from the upstairs spare bedroom. Her heart begins to pound. The fear starts rising up. As Susan didn't want to go up by herself, so she grabs up the cat that she was snuggled with and she runs upstairs. Heart still pounding, but she opens the bedroom door. And in that spare bedroom is where she kept her work uniform. So she had to go to work that night. She was so scared, she said she just grabbed it up real quick and ran back downstairs to get ready. She hops in her car soon thereafter and heads to work. As soon as she walks in, John saw Susan's face and he could tell she looked very shook up. He starts telling Susan that he told Dawn about all the occult activity that Susan had kind of dabbled in her past, and that he hoped she didn't mind. And Susan didn't. This guy, Don, he actually had a house church in his home. Susan and Gary had actually been there a few times before, as well as John and his wife. So John's chatting with Susan about his and Don's conversation, and he says, Don mentioned something. He said that you might have some possessions in your home that are associated with your old days years ago when you were dabbling in all that stuff. Any items of that sort are definitely something you want to get rid of because your unwanted visitor, basically the one that's making all the noises in their home, could feel tied to whatever those items are. Well, Susan asked John, how am I supposed to know what items they are so I can get rid of them? John tells her, when you go home tonight, think upon it, pray upon it, and ask God to show you what reminds you of your time the most when you were dabbling into those occultic activities. Well, later on that night, she gets home. She tells her husband, Gary, about her and John's conversation and all that they talked about. And Gary said to Susan, he said, quote, I guess your heavy metal and druggy albums might remind you of those days. You don't listen to them anymore. I don't know why you still have them, end quote. Susan knew her husband had a very good point. She didn't listen to them anymore, and she hadn't really thought about them in a long time. So the two of them grab an old moving box from the garage, and they begin loading up all those music albums into it. Susan said that night when she went to bed, she slept quite well. The next morning was a Sunday, so her and Gary decide to go to Dawn's church house. After the service, her and Gary both talk to Dawn and they tell him about all the music albums. Dawn tells them, music has a powerful effect on the soul. So he agreed and thought that that was a good idea, that they were getting them all boxed up and out of there. And as they're still chit-chatting, her husband, Gary, he chimes in and he says, Susan, you once mentioned that spirit guide told you to write down certain messages in your journals. You should probably go through those and get rid of them. Susan had kind of forgotten all about them. She said that they were still packed up in a box somewhere in the house, and she hadn't unpacked them since her and Gary got married. Don then had a great idea. He asks for the next Sunday for Gary and his wife, Susan, as well as John and his wife, that they all come together after the service next weekend and just have lunch together. They all agreed, and Susan even chimed in and said, I'll bring that box of journals and we can go through them to get rid of them as well. The next Sunday comes. They have lunch, they enjoy time and fellowship with each other, and then they get to it. They start going through all of the journals that Susan brought. And as John's thumbing through one of them, he's reading, and he tells Susan, he says that one of them was talking about Susan walking across this skinny, long bridge. And she's trying to get to this angelic figure at the end, but she can't because all these demons were clawing at her feet and legs, preventing her from getting across that bridge. So these are all things that Susan had wrote about in one of those journals. And Susan, she said, that is so strange. I don't remember writing that. That's so spooky. Well, less than an hour's time, they had gone through all of the journals she had in the box. They got a burn barrel, a match, and they lit them on fire. That day, before they did that, Susan said she thought that she was going to feel a bit of sadness because of all the time that she had done over those years making those writings and journals. So she thought she'd feel kind of sad about that. But it was exactly the opposite. She said there was no sadness. Instead, she said it was the biggest relief. It was like this big weight off her chest. Needless to say, they never had any more bumps or noises in their home after that. So that was indeed what they needed to do. This story got me thinking, after I read through it and made my notes and everything, it got me thinking about my own life and our own lives in general. If we have certain things that aren't adding value to it, or definitely if they are of the occultic, they need to be gotten rid of because things like this happen. I'm sure if you watched my channel, you know how big spiritual warfare is and that it is real. And I also agree with Don, how he said in the story that music has a powerful effect on our souls. I so believe that. And I mean, just think about it for a second. You hear a favorite song, whether it's from years ago or current, come on, and you just want to sing it. Maybe you connect with it because it was a time you struggled in life, so you can relate to the lyrics. Maybe a breakup or somebody passing away, or it could be happiness. It could be anything. You just connect with it, right? So I don't think there's any doubt that music has that powerful effect on us like that with our souls. So I think we should be mindful of what we are listening to. I think back to, especially when I was a teenager, a song would come on and it could have angry lyrics or something, and then it would affect my mood. I remember being very moody after hearing it, even if I liked the song. To this day, that still happens. So I think we do need to be very mindful about what we listen to, what we read, all of those things. I think this story is a great reminder of that. And then, of course, if any of you guys or anybody you know are ever having issues like Gary and Susan in the story, where you're hearing noises or just really weird things like that, take note. Ask God about it. Just like they did, to show you if there's anything in your lives or in your homes that you need to get rid of. So anyway, this story just left me with food for thought. I hope it does you too. I hope their testimony was a blessing to you guys. I hope it was helpful. I thank you for watching. I really appreciate you guys and all your support and your kind comments and emails. It's very appreciative. So thank you so much. I hope you have an incredible week, everyone. I'll see you next time.